everyone, and welcome to episode 181 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danielle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Here at the Medieval Podcast, it's all about books, especially in the depths of winter. Each year, it's an absolute pleasure to discover new works by both established historians and up-and-comers that expand our collective knowledge, challenge old ideas, and illuminate new corners of the medieval world. As I do every year, I've invited Peter Konieczny from Medievalist.net to come on the podcast and discuss some of the year's best books. As a trained librarian, Peter has a nose for a good one. So this week, each of us will be talking about our top 5 books of the year, as well as a few others that got snuck in there, to help you find your next medieval read to cozy up with. And it's all coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Peter. It's that time of year again where we get to talk about some of our favorite books from this year.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's always fun to kind of take a look back at 2022 for the year in books.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you and I are serious book addicts, so we collect a lot. No one can see, but I can see behind you. There's like a whole stack of books just leaning in the background.
I know I have more books than I have room for. This year, I made a conscious decision that I'm going to just kind of concentrate my collection on translated texts.
And how's that going? Have you weeded out anything?
I did quite a lot of weeding out this year, but I still have way too many books. Of course, it grows, right? I think this week it grew by like 5 or 6. So.
I love it. It's ideal, except for when you have to narrow it down to 5 books, because as usual, we have each picked 5 books. And I don't know about you, but I'm not ranking them in any particular order. Are yours ranked in order?
I have a number 1, but beyond that, all the others are, I would say equally good. But yeah, I have one that I thought was probably the most important book for this year. So.
Okay, so let's leave that until last. Are you ready to dive in?
Yes.
Okay, what is your first book on your list of 5 best books this year?
Okay, my first one is Keisha Tracy's Why Study the Middle Ages. It's one of those short books from the Past and Perfect series. Basically, it answers what, as historians, should we be doing? What kind of questions should we be asking? It's a little self-congratulatory, these things. Yeah, we're doing a great job when we answer these questions. But I think it's important that we do look and see, what is the reasons we do why we do? What's important for us now, and how can we look back at the medieval past and help us answer questions for today as well as historical questions.
I love it. And we had Keisha Tracy on the podcast right near the beginning. She's talking about disability in the Middle Ages. And I love Keisha. And she's one of these people who is just a super passionate medievalist, super passionate teacher. So I can see how this would be a fun book to read. So who would you recommend this book for, do you say?
I would say if you are like an undergraduate and you're thinking, hey, I want to go more in depth into the medieval studies, like you want to make that your major, that would be, I think, like an ideal target. Like also a graduate student. I saw a lot of what she's talking about when we did the Medieval Grad podcast and saw how people are exploring different ways like STEM, disability studies, which is really featured a lot in this book. Those kind of things. So it's, again, more of a book for people wanting to get into the profession and be a historian. So yeah, that's where I'd see it going to.
Okay. So would you say it's for people who are like undecided about the profession or people who have already set their feet on the path?
I'd say people set their feet on the path, right? Because, it doesn't give you like the basics of the Middle Ages or anything like that. You do have to, you don't get like, hey, we're talking about Richard I. We're talking about diversity, disability, learning about medicine, kind of stuff that you would already need a little bit of background in the Middle Ages to understand, like, these are texts that are being used for broader possibilities.
Right. Okay. Well, this is a good first pick. This is a good way to start us off. Great pick, Peter. Okay, I'm gonna give my first pick for this year. And this is one that I did a podcast on. Not all of my picks have I done a podcast on, but I think all of them but one I've done one on. And this is the Jacquerie of 1358, a French Peasants' Revolt by Justine Firnhaber-Baker. And this one, I would say, is aimed at people who are more into sort of academic text in the way that it's written, but it's definitely not unreadable if you don't usually read that kind of text. It's very readable. But this is about, of course, Peasants' Revolt in France in the 14th century. And I just think it's really important because people are thinking a lot about Peasants' Revolts these days, right? When people are complaining about the state of the world. And so I think it's important to look into one like this, where you get a sense of what's going on in the 14th century, because there's a lot of disasters, there's war, And you get to find out how this developed, so what people's complaints were. And this is kind of fun when you think about how people generally view the Middle Ages as people are happy to live in mud and blood and just be little working beasts. But when you look at the complaints that people had around the Jacquerie, what started the Jacquerie, you really get a sense of the fact that people are the same through the centuries, right? And I think that there's a lot in here that is important about what the Jacques accomplished, how they gathered, and then what the reaction was. Because when you're looking back at chronicles and stuff, it can look a lot like the Jacques were the violent ones, when really what Justine has found is it was the nobles in reaction that were particularly violent. So I think this is an important one for our field, and I really enjoyed that one.
Oh, I remember reading that through as well, and yeah, I quite liked it as a military history too. Right? She's able to kind of, hey, this is how these armies formed, how they fought. Going into this, I only read very short accounts. It's in like Froissart, so it was really good to see an explanation of what was going on behind this, how it all came about, and how they were defeated. Right? So
Yeah.
that I thought that was really interesting aspect of it too. And it really does offer quite a good look at peasant complaints, probably not the right word, but like peasant views on like what's going on in the wider world.
Mm-hmm. Peasants, how they view nobles, nobles, how they view peasants, what's the spin, all of that stuff can be found in here. I think it's a really well researched look at a really important event. So, yeah, that's why I picked that one. What have you got up for us next?
Oh, I got Winters in the World, A Journey Through the Anglo-Saxon Year by Eleanor Parker. People might know of you on Twitter as Clerk of Oxford.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's one of those books, it falls into the kind of genre of everyday life by going through a single typical year. But what I really liked about it was how much it focused on nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how people in the early medieval England perceived and worked with a land that's constantly changing through seasons. And the book is often it's kind of divided really into seasons, with a lot of it told through festivals, Easter and midsummer. I really thought that was a different way of going about it, looking at it through that prism.
Awesome. So, is the work in it in Old English, or is it all modern English and just kind of talking about works?
Yeah, it's in modern English. Eleanor is, by the way, a really good writer. I really enjoyed her writing style. She puts in a lot of translations. Beowulf or Bede pop in all the time.
Mm-hmm.
She quotes a lot from the sources themselves, what it was like, in the middle of winter, what it was like to be cold, right? Yeah,
We're Canadians. We know that feeling pretty well.
yeah. So, yeah, it's easy enough for us. But yeah, like it's a modern English work, so you don't need to have any kind of old English background to read it. So it's very much for the general audience.
Awesome. Yeah, that's one I haven't read yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it. I will probably come and steal it from your shelves one day.
I heard a bunch of good things about it a couple of months ago, so I put it on my like Amazon list, and it was just a very good read, poetic almost.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I haven't met her personally, but I've followed her on Twitter for quite a long time. So I'm glad to hear that this book is so great.
Okay, what's the second one on your list?
This is one I also did a podcast on, and not too long ago, so people might remember. And this is The Deeds of Philip Augustus, an English translation of Rigord's Gesta Philippi Augusti. And it's translated by Larry F. Field, edited by M. Cecilia Gaposchkin and Sean L. Field. And Cecilia and Sean were on the podcast, so we were talking about this before. I like primary sources. I like them so much because they give you such a close look at what's going on. And what's really cool about looking at a chronicle of a particular king's life that's written by somebody during that lifetime is you get to see, as we are talking about on the podcast, you get to see Rigord's perception or his opinion on Philip change over time. So he's really a big fan of his at the beginning, and then Philip does things like set aside his wife or, become unjust, and then Rigord really changes his thoughts about him, but then he's still trying to write it in a way that is sort of tactful. I came to medieval studies through literature, so I'm a person who really likes to dig into narration and really read between the lines. What are we trying to say here? What are we not saying here? So I think a chronicle like this is really fun. And of course, Philip Augustus is just such an influential figure that it's nice to have a look behind the scenes. Plus, they have a really important document in it where when Philip goes on crusade, and this is a famous one, the Third Crusade, he goes on with Richard the Lionheart for people who are following along at home. He writes a whole bill of things that need to be done in his absence. He names his regent. He says what's going to happen with people's debts. And this is a really important document that we may not have had anywhere else. So yeah, this is a really fun translation, and I think eye-opening when it comes to what the life of a medieval king was like and how it looked to the lessers in the realm, you know?
This was actually on my list too. I really thought it was an important book. Like of all the translations that came across my desk this year, I thought this was the most important for historians. Philip reigns from like 1180 to 1223. He's just really influential for France, the development of France. And we get a lot of books that come out that talk about France from like the English perspective. So we often get like, hey, here's Richard the Lionheart on Crusade. And Philip is there as this adversary, not necessarily treated in the best light. So it was good to have this work that offers the pro Philip account. I think it'll be the most quoted thing that we're going to have in recent years for, say, even English history, like Henry and Richard and John, I guess, to a certain extent, with the Third Crusade itself. So, like, it's just an important text. There are also little bits in it I loved, particularly the story of how Paris got its paved roads. Philip was like, I see those streets are so muddy, dirty. Pave them all.
Yeah.
Pave them all. Let's get a project. That's how I imagined it from the writing of Rigord. Yeah, I kind of wish that Rigord just lived a few years longer.
Yeah, that would have been nice. But there's a lot of people I think that wish that they lived a few years longer. Maybe Rigord was one of them. Yeah, so that means we're only going to have 9 books. Okay, I'm going to throw another one on then. I'm going to throw another one in there because this one just narrowly missed the cut. And that was Embodying the Soul by Meg Leja. And this is the one that I did a podcast on as well that talks about Carolingian thought around medicine and the body. I'm glad I have a chance to talk about this one too, because as people who listened know, this is really important because the Carolingian period is really early in the Middle Ages. And it's important to look at how people were looking at medicine and the body and the soul, because it's not all superstition, right? I think there is this general perception that's very superstitious or it's very religious to the point at which you don't have a lot of physiological knowledge. But Meg really has looked carefully at these Carolingian sources. And it's a really good look at early medicine. And I think that's always fascinating to me. And I think it's important for the field. So I'm going to slip that one in. We'll call Philip Augustus as one yours, and I'll put Meg's book in as mine.
Oh no! I listened to the podcast. I thought that was a really good episode, and really kind of eye opened what views of health could be.
Absolutely. What do you have next for us?
I have the Abbasid House of Wisdom Between Myth and Reality by Ekmeladin Isenoğlu. So I hope I got the name right. And it's one of those books that, and I'll have another one we're going to talk about, where it looks at a topic that medievalists know a little about, but are kind of trapped in the wrong ideas. This kind of book exposes like your Cole's Notes version of it isn't right. History has kind of built up a false idea. So in the early 9th century, Baghdad, there's a place called the House of Wisdom. The accounts of it are very sparse. So over the years, it's kind of developed an idea that this place morphed into a kind of an academy, even like a proto-university, where scholars of all sorts of fields would come together and have discussions and bring out texts and learn. It was just kind of a vast body of learning. And the authors trying to say like that is just a distortion that's based out of sometimes misreading texts, like mistranslating texts.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly under 2 caliphs, Harun al-Rashid and Caliph al-Mamun in the early 9th century, they kind of build like what really is a palace library for their own use.
Mm-hmm.
But they are also at the same time bringing in scholars of all sorts of fields, basically paying them, and they're all within the court. So this is kind of a personal library that's getting more widely used, if that makes sense. We're seeing a lot of efforts towards translating texts, especially the Greek and Persian texts to Arabic. Those things are kind of ending up there. But it's not necessarily that this house of wisdom is the one creating that, or it's like overseeing it. It's just kind of more of a cog in this learning field that's happening. These caliphs are doing these nightly philosophical bantering sessions, and they'll bring up, hey, we need some books. So there's a librarian there. There's this kind of culture of learning, right? But it's not what we think of in like a modern sense. Hey, scholar from Basra, come here and learn, and you have teachers and access to books. It's not quite that. I'm going to get more and more interested in the episode world.
Mm-hmm.
This was something I thought was pretty good. It's one of those books that will help define what's been a loose idea out there.
Mm-hmm. You're making me think that it's less like a university and more like something out of Doctor Strange, right? A magical library where you learn about all sorts of stuff.
Indeed. It's kind of fascinating. You have to remember these caliphs are incredibly rich, right? And there's also a lot of incredibly rich people in Baghdad at this time. So there's a lot of people promoting scholarship, culture, and things like that. They all kind of get meshed together, muddied together almost for historians, but it's kind of like that vibrant music scene you see in like in a hipster town, right?
I love it. Well, that sounds like a great book for everyone to read to get to know the culture of learning that was happening in Baghdad at the time. I think that's awesome. Okay.
Back to you.
We got to move on because we've got more books to talk about. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next book that I have on my list is one that I haven't done a podcast on yet because I just got this book, but I really enjoyed it. So this book is called Blondin de Cornwalla, a comic Occitan romance. So this is a new translation of this poem that was written in Occitan, and it's all of the things that medieval literature is good for. So it is a story of a knight from Cornwall, and his name is Blondin, and he has all of these adventures. There's like damsels in distress, there's giants, there's magical creatures. He has to like slay a whole bunch of people. He's got a sidekick that also is doing all of this stuff. It's the most wonderful stuff from medieval romance here in another romance. And because it's a new translation, it's not a romance that I'm familiar with. So it's kind of nice at this point in my career to come across new romances, right? Because it re-sparks that joy that I had from them. The whole reason that I got into medieval studies was because of romances. I do have to say that there are a couple pages in it where he has to fight a quote unquote Saracen, which is interesting, I think, to look at from a scholarly perspective, but it's also super uncomfortable from, a human perspective, because this is written in a dialect from a place where they're kind of close to Spain. So they have some ideas of what Islamic culture could be like, but this guy only has like the barest ideas of it. This person in it has a beard, has dark skin, but is otherwise just a giant, like in any other medieval romance. He's got like boar tusks. So this is obviously somebody's idea of what could be scary. So I do want to say there is this, well, definitely super racist description of a quote unquote Saracen in this. But I think you can almost never find a romance that doesn't have something troubling in it. So if you can get past that, or you can look at it with a critical eye and really learn from that, this has all of those things that I love, at least, of medieval romance. Knights, damsels, magic. It reminds me of the description of The Princess Bride, right? It's got sword fights, it's got true love, revenge. All of these things are in this book.
Oh, yeah. Would you say this is something that you would give a person that hasn't read a lot about the Middle Ages? Here's a nice work of literature to read. Where would you put it on the scale of how much knowledge you need to get in?
Well, again, because you have a pretty racist figure in there, I would like the people to read it to have some idea of context and really understand how this might come about. So that's important, so that you have an understanding of intercultural relations at the time and how you might have a caricature like this in here. But I think people who listen to the Medieval podcast will be fine reading this. It does come from Medieval Institute Press, so it is aimed at undergraduates and scholars in that the introduction is stuff about the text, stuff about the background, not really in the 14th century, these things were happening. You know what I mean? So the poem is super accessible, super readable, but you do kind of have to have a little bit of context to understand where these ideas might be coming from. People who listen to this podcast, I think, will be A-okay, but you probably don't want to give it to your grandma for Christmas because there's context that needs to be taken into account when you read it. So that was a good question. Thank you for asking that one.
I think I'd like to have a look into that text myself. Maybe I'll borrow it from you.
Yeah, it's fun. Okay, what have you got next?
Well, I'm going to throw another book in. So I'm throwing in one called the Kushnama, the Persian epic of Kush to Tusked. Here, our semi-monstrous figure is the hero of the story.
I love it.
I haven't read it fully through, but it's a late medieval epic of this anti-hero that goes around the world from Iberia all the way into East Asia. It's a bit of a heavy read, I have to say, but again, if you're looking for a more global outlook, this might be a very good text to try. It's a bit of a heavy read though, so that's why I've only been like maybe about 30 pages into it so far.
And you still picked it as one of your tops?
I made that call right now. From what I can see, it's like just an interesting story in itself. And I know I've picked a lot of translations before, so I kind of left it out. But we can do what we want on this podcast, right?
We follow my rules, man.
Oh.
All right. That means it's back to me. I'm going to talk about one that I did a while back. It ended up on the podcast because I thought it was important. So I really want to give it another shout out. And that is Oceania, 800 to 1800 CE, a millennium of interactions in a sea of islands by James Flexner. And this is kind of a cheat because it's a Cambridge element. So it's not necessarily a quote unquote book. I don't think you can pick it up in paper, but it is a digital, fully realized text. And I loved this one because I always wanted to know more and I didn't really know where to find more about Oceania. So this was a great read to tell me what's going on across the world, globally, technologically, and in terms of what people value. Because if we only look at Europe, we're only looking at one piece of the puzzle. We're never going to see the whole thing if we're only looking at one piece. So even though my main interest is in Europe, I want to know what's going on because other people in the world have all sorts of great stuff that's happening to them, with them, and there's interactions between all the different places in the world. So I loved this book. I got to have a better understanding of what was going on there. And of course, all of these different islands have their own cultures, so you can never really get at it in one single book. But to me, this is a great jumping off point to learn more about this time and place. So I loved it.
Can you integrate the book into like a more global understanding of the Middle Ages?
Oh, totally. I don't think you could have a full understanding of the Middle Ages without taking Oceania into account. It's a huge part of the globe. It takes up a massive area. So yeah, I don't think you can discount it in any way. But as somebody who came into this tradition from looking at England and France, the kind of the traditional way many of us came into this study of history, to me, it was great to learn more. And I was so happy to have been exposed to this book, and I want more people to read it.
I think that the whole series that's come out is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking forward to see what they'll else come out with.
Yeah, there's a lot coming out all the time. So I'm hoping to feature more of them on the podcast. And again, part of the Cambridge elements that I featured already, one of them was Persian poetry with Shazad Bashir. So people could check that out as well. I mean, listen to all of the podcasts from this year if you haven't already, right?
Indeed. Give yourself 48 hours. Listen to everything.
What else are you doing over the holidays? All right, Peter, are we at the end? Are we at your number one?
I am at my number one. What I think will be the most influential book going forward for medievalists and like historians, what will change the field? And to me, it is Poisoned Wells, Accusations, Persecution, and Minorities in Medieval Europe, 1321 to 1422 by Tasfir Barzilay. Like with the Abbasid House of Wisdom, medievalists understand a little bit, but there's a far more complex and interesting story that can get told if you dive into the sources. What I kind of knew before going into this, my medieval 101 as a student, you get the version that the Black Death in Europe happens, and then the Jewish population gets accused of poisoning wells. Barzilay, meanwhile, starts it off in 1321, where the accusations are at first against lepers in particular, but also kind of like the minority outsiders of Europe, vagabonds, even friars. And they go on to explain how this conspiracy theory, I guess, grows in parts of Europe. One of the fascinating things I learned about it is when and where these accusations take place, because they don't happen in Italy. They don't happen in Castile. Why not? It's happening quite a bit in France, spreads into German lands, other parts of Europe, how the story gets reformed and changed as it moves along, which I thought was really quite interesting.
Yeah. I featured Safrir on the podcast a few months ago talking about this book. And I think it is going to be a really important one, not only because he looks at the origin of these accusations, how far back do they go, where do they come from, but the process by which he pulls this apart, finding the precedents, I think is going to be instructive to other historians who are looking at this kind of thing. And I think it really goes to show that we have to always be continually investigating even the things that we think we know and always adding more to our knowledge because, like you say, many of us were taught just a really simple version of that story. And that's why Safir's book is out now. So he was the person who really dug into it. And I really think it's important to always interrogate what we think we know. And that's what this book does.
As we often talk about, like in present day, like fake news and how it perpetuates, he's very good at saying these are the groups that are promoting the idea and what's their reasoning for it. Why do they shift to talking about Jewish people in particular? What was their aims? If you were having an undergraduate class, I'd almost recommend that as, a reading. Hey, here is a story that you know a little bit about. Let's dive deeper into it, and you discover a whole bunch more. It tells us more about not just the Middle Ages, but I think human society.
Yeah, well, and there's a huge discussion going on right now about anti-Semitism, and a lot of people's anti-Semitic ideas go back to the Middle Ages, if not further back. So it's really important to look at what anti-Semitism was like in the Middle Ages so we have more context, so we can trace these things back and have more ammunition to fight against that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? So I think that this is an important book. Good choice, man.
Exactly. I have an addendum also for an additional book. If you're going to get that, you also should get Richard Cole's The Death of Tidericus the Organist. So that seems like an odd title at the beginning, but it's Plague and Conspiracy Theory in Hanseatic Visby, which is Gotland, Sweden in 1350. Unfortunately, I don't think Barsley was able to get his hands on the book before he finished his. They came out just like a year apart. And it's focused on accusations and people that got executed in this Swedish port and the letters that the town council sends out explaining what's happening. And they're, again, blaming Jewish people. Although there's no Jewish people within like 1,000 miles of this island, they're still getting involved in this kind of conspiracy theory that involves silver pouches and bringing in poison from city to city. It's very interesting how the authors send out 2 letters and they have the story take place at 2 different places based on who are receiving these letters. Oh, this person's attacking Sweden. No, this person's attacking Germany. This is coming from Sweden or coming from Germany, depending on who their audience is. So I thought it was a good case study of what Barsley is talking about.
So wait, who was attacking Sweden?
This conspiracy.
Okay.
The conspiracists are moving through one area of territory, and the authors of the same letters then say, no, he was actually moving through this other territory to come to Visby. They could lie. It only gets exposed if you can see both letters at the same time.
Yeah. Although I don't think medieval people were dumb, so I imagine many of them saw through that kind of stuff anyway. But it is important to recognize the impact of conspiracy theory then and now. It'll give us a good look at now when we look at the Middle Ages in terms of conspiracy theory. If we're coming back to Safir's book, because I haven't read the other one, I think that Poisoned Wells is a great book.
Any kind of medieval historian should probably need that on their bookshelf. That's my definite recommendation for the year.
Awesome. Okay, I have one more. Although you slipped in another one. I can't believe it. I don't even know how many we're at right now. Okay, so this is my last one. And this is a book that I know I'm going to come to again and again. And this really speaks to me as a medievalist. And I hope it'll speak to everyone else too, because I think this is really fascinating. And that is Household Goods and Good Households in Late Medieval London. This is by Catherine French. And she was on the podcast talking about this as well. This is a book that talks about the possessions that people had within their homes. And I think that's fascinating because when we think about history, we look at it from bird's eye view. We don't see things like what were they eating with? What did that particular spoon look like? And I always want to know more about that. What did they actually put their hands on during the course of a day? So Catherine has gone through all sorts of legal documents, legal cases and wills, and she's been able to pull out a lot of different views of what people had in their homes. And sometimes she's going room by room and she's demonstrating that in this room they had these things. This might be a layout at this time. This might be a layout at this time. And it's just fascinating. And some of my favorite things in it are wills. So we talked about wills on the podcast about this, and this particular woman who's my favorite, who talks about, you can find the things that I've left for my children. They're all in bundles with their names on them. Like that kind of human story is always what speaks to me. So I love this book. I'm going to come back to it again and again because I'm always interested in the tangible, the very material world of the Middle Ages. So Household Goods is one of my favorite books this year, and it's probably going to remain one of my favorite books because of that real human look at life every day.
Daily life is always a fascinating element. And I think most people that just start off learning about the Middle Ages, that's what they want to know.
Yeah.
What did you do when you got up? What did you do when you got to work? What was around the house? And London's the place to learn about that.
Yeah, it's cosmopolitan. It's a port. It's got all sorts of different people in it and pretty good records of what was going on at the time. So you get a very close view of what things are like at the time. And one of the other things that I really quite liked about it is you find out when people started to get more money, because this is talking about post Black Death, 14th century and into the 15th century, when people started to have more material wealth, what they spend their money on. And it's things that make their houses look nice, you know, tapestries and hangings for your bed and better basins for washing your hands when you come in the house. And I love that kind of stuff because it's just so human.
Was it able to define like any kind of trends in stuff? Was there something that in 1420 everyone had to have?
Probably, but I don't remember 1420 in particular. But it was more just that as people started to have more wealth, they started to add things that were for everyday hospitality. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. So they did have things like better towels, better basins, so that when they brought people into their homes, they could do it in a way that looked fancy and was welcoming. And I think that's really cool. And also a lot of things that made their bodies comfortable. And I think that really is so common to us all, right? If you get a little bit of extra cash, you might spend it going to the movies or something like that, but you might spend it on something that makes your home just that much more welcoming to yourself or others. So I loved this book.
Now you talk about it, I really have to get my hands on that too. You know, like, oh man, I could read about that on medievalists.
Yeah, I'm going to write my name in it so that it comes back to me because you can't keep it. It'll get lost on your shelves.
Oh no. All right. I'll put it on the pile, Danielle's books.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And I will come and police that pile and make sure my stuff comes back to me. Well, thanks for coming on, Peter, because I think that between the two of us, we have covered a wide range of topics for people to explore as we move into 2023, which still sounds like a futuristic date to me.
Indeed. It's been a fun year of reading books. The two of us can't cover everything. And I know so many books have crossed our paths already. And like they're talking about really interesting ways to look at the medieval past. And I'm just in awe of what everyone can produce.
Mm-hmm. Especially because the stuff that's been coming out this year and next year is stuff that people have been writing during a pandemic. So hats off to all of these authors for their extremely hard work. The ones that we featured and the ones that we haven't featured. I don't tend to feature a lot of essay collections on this podcast, but I'm certainly in support of all of that work that's getting done in essay collections because I really feel like this field is constantly moving forward in really great and healthy ways for the most part. So it's always exciting to read new books.
Now, we don't have a new book of yours to talk about right now because nothing came out officially in 2022, but we have stuff to look forward for in 2023, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm now in the editing stage, the scary stage of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World. And that's going to come out in the last part of 2023, September, October, around there.
Yeah, I'm always looking forward for your books. So I have my little collection of your books too.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Those ones already have my name in them. Do you have an update for what's on the website for us today?
Just something I'm going to be working on, and hopefully it'll be done, is I'm looking at jobs in the medieval village. So I'm particularly focused on a book. It came out like decades ago about war boys, this small medieval village. It was by Ambrose Raftis. So if you're University of Toronto, you might know his name. It was like a kind of legendary historian back in the time. And I'm just kind of taking a look and see like his really in-depth look at that one particular village and his records and seeing what were the more popular jobs outside of farming that people had to do. In a small village, how many were farmers and how many were butchers or bakers or blacksmiths?
I thought you were going to say candlestick makers.
I should have.
Missed opportunity.
So I'm hoping I'll have that out in like about a week's time.
That sounds awesome. We will all look forward to that. Well, thanks again for coming on, Peter, and telling us about your favorite books.
Thank you.
Everyone knows that the holidays are a time for gratitude, so a big thank you goes out to everyone who so generously supports this podcast via medievalist.net's Patreon page each month. Patrons have access to all sorts of great stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of this podcast. To become a patron and forever stay on the nice list, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. Whether you're lighting a menorah or a tree this week, celebrating Kwanzaa, or simply enjoying some well-deserved time with family and friends, I hope you have a restful, peaceful, delicious, and happy holiday. For everything from great reads to trusty steeds, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danielle Sobalski, on social media at 5MIN-Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and happy holidays.